My name is Scarlett Lee. I'm 32 years old, and I was 16 when my own mother stood at the front door with my backpack in her hands and told me I was no longer part of the family. I can still see her face, cold and decided, like she'd been rehearsing that moment for months. The door closed behind me, and with it, any illusion I had about unconditional love or safety nets. You won't believe what happened years later when that same woman needed my signature to save everything she had left. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If this story is hitting close to home, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. You're going to want to see how this unfolds. That day changed the entire trajectory of my life, and honestly, I didn't think I'd survive the first month on my own. I was just a kid with nowhere to go, no backup plan, and no one to call when things got hard. But here's the thing about being thrown into the deep end with no lifeguard. You either drown or you learn to swim faster than you ever thought possible. And I learned to swim. So you're probably wondering how a 16-year-old girl with nothing but a backpack and a broken heart ended up in a position of power years later, right? Well, let me take you back to where it all started. Because the journey from that doorstep to the boardroom wasn't about revenge. It was about something far more powerful. It was about building a life so solid that I never needed their approval again. And when they finally came back into my life, it wasn't on their terms anymore. I had 16 years of memories in that house, and it took 16 seconds for my mother, Rebecca, to erase all of them. She didn't yell, didn't cry, didn't even look conflicted about her decision. She just handed me my backpack like she was returning a borrowed item and said those words that still echo in my head: "You're not part of this family anymore." My younger brother, Ethan, watched from the living room window, his face pressed against the glass, and I could see the confusion in his eyes. He was only 12, too young to understand why his sister was suddenly being erased from family photos and dinner tables. I stood on that porch for what felt like an eternity, waiting for someone to open the door and say it was a mistake, a cruel joke, anything but reality. But the porch light went off, and I heard the lock click into place, a sound so final it felt like a coffin closing. That's when I realized that blood doesn't guarantee loyalty, and family isn't always a safety net. Sometimes it's the very thing that pushes you off the edge. I walked down the driveway with tears streaming down my face, my backpack feeling heavier with every step, carrying everything I owned and nothing that mattered. What I didn't know then was that this rejection would become the foundation of everything I built later. Years down the line, Rebecca would sit across from me in a lawyer's office, her hands shaking as she held documents that required my signature, documents that could save or destroy her financial future. But that moment was still far away, hidden behind years of struggle, growth, and transformation. Little did I know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would teach me the difference between being wanted and being valuable. This isn't a story about screaming matches or dramatic confrontations where someone throws a drink in someone else's face. It's about something quieter, but infinitely more powerful. It's about what happens when you have to raise yourself because no one else will. I didn't have anyone to call when I was scared. No safety net when I made mistakes. No shoulder to cry on when the loneliness became unbearable. And in that absence of comfort, I discovered something I never knew existed inside me. An unshakable core that didn't need external validation to survive. That's the kind of strength that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. The world doesn't prepare you for what it feels like to be completely alone at 16, when everyone else your age is worried about prom dates and college applications while you're trying to figure out where you'll sleep tonight. I learned to navigate a world that wasn't designed for people without backup plans, where every decision carried weight because there was no one to catch me if I fell. I became fluent in survival, in reading people's intentions, in understanding that kindness often came with conditions. And slowly, almost without realizing it, I stopped seeking warmth from people who had shown me they could turn cold in an instant. What emerged from that isolation wasn't bitterness, though I'd be lying if I said there weren't nights I felt consumed by it. What grew instead was clarity, the kind of razor-sharp understanding about who you are when no one's watching, when no one's applauding, when no one even knows your name. I learned that love and approval are two different currencies. and I'd been bankrupt in one while unknowingly rich in the other. The silence that once felt like punishment became the canvas where I painted an entirely new version of myself, one that didn't need Rebecca's approval or anyone else's permission to exist. There was no long argument that night, no buildup of tension that I could have seen coming and prepared for. Rebecca simply made her decision behind closed doors with my stepfather, David, and presented it to me like a business transaction that had already been finalized. I remember walking into the living room after school, still wearing my backpack, and seeing them both sitting on the couch with expressions that made my stomach drop. David wouldn't even look at me, just stared at his hands while Rebecca did all the talking, her voice steady and rehearsed. "We've made a decision about your future, and we think it's best if you find somewhere else to live," she said, as if she was discussing dinner plans. "Before I continue, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is absolutely insane. And leave a like if you're as shocked as I was when this happened to me." I asked her why, my voice breaking, and she gave me a list of reasons that felt like they'd been compiled over years. I was too difficult, too independent, too much of a financial burden now that David had lost his job. But I could see through the corporate language of her excuses. I was a reminder of her first marriage, of a life before David, and I didn't fit into the new family portrait they were trying to paint. Ethan fit because he was David's biological son, but I was just a leftover from a chapter she wanted to close. The actual moment of leaving is burned into my memory with painful clarity. Rebecca handed me my backpack, already packed with my clothes, and walked me to the door like she was escorting a stranger out of her home. I looked back one last time, hoping to see some crack in her armor, some hint of the mother who used to braid my hair and read me bedtime stories. But her face was stone, and the door closed with a finality that felt like a verdict being read in court. That night, I learned that rejection doesn't always come with explanations that make sense. Sometimes people just decide you're not worth keeping, and you have to live with that. The first week after being kicked out was a blur of couch surfing and favors I knew I couldn't repay. My best friend at the time, Jessica, let me stay at her place for 3 nights before her parents started asking uncomfortable questions about how long I'd be there. I ended up at a youth shelter downtown, sharing a room with 5 other girls who all had their own versions of family rejection stories. We didn't talk much about our pasts. There was an unspoken understanding that we were all just trying to survive the present, one day at a time. I kept my backpack under my pillow every night because it contained everything I had left in the world. Finding work at 16 without parental consent was nearly impossible, but desperation makes you creative. I lied about my age at a diner called Martha's Kitchen, saying I was 18 and had lost my documents in a house fire. The owner, an older woman named Carol, looked at me with eyes that said she knew I was lying but hired me anyway. I worked the early morning shift before school, serving coffee to construction workers and truck drivers who tipped in crumpled dollar bills. Every meal became a strategic decision. Could I afford to eat today? Or should I save that money for the phone bill so potential employers could reach me? The exhaustion was crushing in ways I couldn't have prepared for. I'd finish my shift at the diner, go to school running on 3 hours of sleep, then work an evening shift at a convenience store where I stood behind bulletproof glass and watched people live normal lives. My classmates complained about strict parents and curfews while I envied their problems, wishing I had someone who cared enough to set boundaries. But here's what no one tells you about surviving without a net. You develop reflexes that people with safety nets never need. You learn to read situations faster, to assess risks with brutal honesty, to become your own parent, cheerleader, and life coach all at once. The kind of loneliness I experienced in those years wasn't just about being physically alone. It was about carrying every decision, every fear, every small victory by myself, with no one to share it with. I'd see other teenagers walking home from school, complaining to their parents on the phone about trivial things, and I'd feel this sharp ache in my chest, knowing I didn't have anyone to call just to say I had a bad day. Holidays were the worst, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas, when the entire world seemed designed to remind you that you were supposed to be with family. I worked double shifts on those days, volunteering to cover for people who had somewhere to go, because being busy was better than sitting alone with my thoughts. But something unexpected happened in all that silence and isolation. I started to hear myself clearly for the first time in my life. Without Rebecca's voice telling me who I should be, without the constant noise of trying to fit into a family that didn't want me, I had space to figure out who I actually was. I discovered I was stronger than I thought, more resilient, more capable of handling things that would have broken the version of me that lived in that house. I learned to sit with discomfort instead of running from it, to make decisions based on my own judgment, rather than seeking approval I'd never get anyway. The loneliness carved out something inside me that I can only describe as unshakable self-reliance. I stopped waiting for someone to rescue me, stopped hoping that Rebecca would realize her mistake and come find me. Instead, I became my own rescue mission, my own source of encouragement on days when getting out of bed felt impossible. Like iron being tempered in fire, the heat of isolation didn't destroy me. It made me harder, sharper, more defined. And years later, when I finally had the resources to build a life of my own, I realized that the loneliness hadn't been a punishment at all. It had been preparation for everything that came next. I was 19 when I made a conscious decision to stop trying to prove I was worthy of love. Up until that point, every achievement, every good grade, every promotion at work was secretly motivated by this desperate hope that somehow Rebecca would hear about it and realize she'd made a mistake. I imagined these fantasy scenarios where she'd show up and apologize, where she'd see how well I was doing and want me back. But one day, standing in my tiny studio apartment that I'd worked 3 jobs to afford, I looked at myself in the mirror and asked a question that changed everything. What if I just stopped performing for an audience that isn't even watching? If you've ever felt like you had to earn your place in the world, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. This next part is going to resonate with you deeply. I started making decisions based purely on what I wanted, not on what would make me look successful to people who'd already decided I didn't matter. I enrolled in community college to study business, not because it would impress anyone, but because I was genuinely fascinated by how companies were built from nothing. I stopped dating people who reminded me of the conditional love I'd grown up with, and started building friendships with people who valued competence over performance, authenticity over approval. The shift was subtle, but revolutionary. I traded the exhausting work of seeking validation for the quieter, more sustainable work of building competence. Every skill I learned, every certification I earned, every business strategy I mastered became a brick in the foundation of a life that belonged entirely to me. I wasn't trying to prove Rebecca wrong anymore. I was trying to prove myself right, to demonstrate to the scared 16-year-old version of me that we were going to be okay, that we were going to be more than okay. And that internal shift, from external validation to internal conviction, was the moment I stopped being a victim of my circumstances and started being the architect of my future. My first real business wasn't glamorous or impressive by anyone's standards except mine. At 22, I started a small consulting service helping local businesses optimize their inventory management, something I'd learned from years of working retail and watching managers waste money on poor ordering systems. I worked out of coffee shops with my laptop, charging rates so low that I was barely breaking even, but every client I landed felt like winning the lottery. My first official check was for $300, and I stared at it for 10 minutes before depositing it because it represented something no paycheck from an employer ever could, proof that I could create value on my own terms. Nobody threw me a party when I registered my LLC or when I landed my 10th client. There was no proud parent taking photos, no family celebration, no one to call and share the excitement with. I remember sitting alone in my apartment the night I signed my first contract worth $5,000, eating takeout Chinese food straight from the container, thinking about how different this moment would look if I had a family to share it with. But then something shifted in my perspective. Maybe the absence of external celebration made the victory more mine, more pure, untainted by the need to perform success for an audience. The business was small and humble, operating in the shadows of corporate giants, but it paid my bills without me having to answer to anyone. It respected my boundaries, my time, my vision in ways that working for someone else never could. Every invoice I sent, every satisfied client, every problem I solved added another layer to my confidence, proving that the skills I'd developed through necessity were actually valuable in the marketplace. What started as survival was transforming into something that looked suspiciously like success, and the best part was that it belonged entirely to me. No one could take it away. No one could kick me out of my own creation. While Rebecca and David had no idea where I was or what I was doing, I was making mistakes and learning from them at a pace that only comes from having everything on the line. I failed at my first attempt to scale the business, hiring too quickly and nearly going bankrupt within 6 months. I lost clients because I was too proud to admit when I didn't know something, then learned humility the hard way when they left scathing reviews. But every failure taught me something that no business school could have, because the consequences were immediate and personal. There was no safety net to catch me, no family money to bail me out if I screwed up. I developed a reputation in my industry for being reliable, strategic, and brutally honest about what clients actually needed versus what they wanted to hear. Other consultants would overpromise to land contracts, but I'd learned that integrity was the only currency that appreciated over time when you had nothing else to trade on. My client list grew slowly but steadily, built on referrals from people who trusted my work enough to stake their own reputations on recommending me. By my mid-20s, I was managing projects for mid-size companies, solving problems that executives twice my age couldn't figure out. The growth was like a tree root system developing underground, invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. I wasn't posting success stories on social media or trying to make Rebecca notice me. I was too busy actually building something real to worry about optics. Each quarter brought new challenges that pushed me further than I thought I could go, and each time I surprised myself by rising to meet them. Years were passing, seasons were changing, and somewhere in that relentless forward motion, I stopped being the rejected teenager and became someone I actually respected. Someone who didn't need external validation because the work itself was proof enough. I was 28 when I got the call that changed everything, though not in the way you might expect. A private equity firm had been watching my consulting work for months, impressed by how I'd helped 3 of their portfolio companies turn around failing operations. They offered me a position as chief operating officer for a struggling retail chain they'd just acquired, with equity and a salary that made my hands shake when I saw the offer letter. The CEO title would come later, they said, once I proved I could handle the turnaround. But even the COO role felt surreal for someone who'd started by serving coffee at Martha's Kitchen. Make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is absolutely crazy, and hit that like button if you think hard work actually pays off. The day I accepted that position, I sat in my apartment and thought about the 16-year-old girl who'd been told she wasn't worth keeping, who'd slept in shelters and survived on vending machine food. I thought about every double shift, every night spent studying business strategy books from the library, every client meeting where I walked in terrified but walked out victorious. This wasn't just a career milestone, it was vindication for every person who'd ever been told they weren't enough. Proof that your starting point doesn't determine your destination. But here's what struck me most about that moment. There was no family to call, no parents to burst with pride, no childhood home to return to with good news. I celebrated alone with a bottle of wine I didn't finish, and Chinese takeout from the same restaurant I'd ordered from for years. And yet, somehow, that solitary celebration felt more authentic than any crowded party could have been. I had climbed this mountain without anyone pushing me from behind or pulling me from above. Every single step had been mine, and that made reaching the summit mean something that people with safety nets might never fully understand. I was 31, nearly a year into my role as CEO after successfully turning the company profitable, when my assistant buzzed my office with a call I never expected. "There's a Rebecca Mitchell online too," she said. And for a moment I couldn't place the name because I'd stopped thinking of her as Rebecca Mitchell years ago. She was just a ghost from a past life I'd worked hard to leave behind. My hand hovered over the phone for what felt like minutes, my heart racing with a mixture of emotions I couldn't name. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately, to protect the peace I'd built so carefully. But curiosity won, the way it always does when unfinished chapters suddenly demand to be read. Her voice was exactly as I remembered it. But there was something different underneath, an uncertainty, a carefulness that hadn't been there when she'd handed me that backpack years ago. "Scarlett," she said, and even hearing her say my name felt strange, like a word from a foreign language I used to speak fluently. "I know this is unexpected, and you have every right to hang up on me, but I need to talk to you about something urgent. It's about your stepfather's estate and some legal documents that require your signature." She didn't apologize, didn't ask how I was doing, didn't acknowledge the years of silence. She just cut straight to the need, and somehow that felt perfectly consistent with the woman I remembered. I told her I'd have my lawyer contact her to discuss the details, keeping my voice professionally neutral, giving away nothing of the storm happening inside me. After I hung up, I sat at my desk staring at the city skyline through my office windows, trying to process what had just happened. The woman who'd erased me from her life now needed something from me, needed my signature on documents that apparently only I could sign. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that it felt like looking at a photographic negative of my childhood. Everything that had been dark was now light, and everything that had been light was now dark. And I realized with absolute clarity that this wasn't about revenge or vindication, it was about choice. And for the first time in our relationship, all the choices were mine. 2 days later, I sat in my attorney's office while he explained the situation with the kind of careful language lawyers use when the stakes are incredibly high. David had passed away 6 months earlier, something Rebecca hadn't bothered to inform me about, and his estate was tied up in a complicated trust that he'd established years ago. Apparently, when I was still legally part of the family, David had included me as a contingent beneficiary in certain documents, probably for tax purposes, never imagining I'd actually be relevant to his financial legacy. Now those same documents required my signature to transfer assets to Rebecca, and without it, everything would be frozen in probate for years, potentially costing her hundreds of thousands in legal fees and taxes. My lawyer looked at me across his mahogany desk and said something I'll never forget. "You have all the leverage here, Scarlett. You can set whatever terms you want, or you can walk away entirely and let the estate sort itself out." The irony was almost poetic. The family that had decided I was worthless now needed me to save their financial future. Rebecca wasn't asking for reconciliation or forgiveness. She was asking for a business transaction, which somehow felt more honest than any emotional appeal could have been. She needed my cooperation, and for the first time in our entire relationship, I held something she desperately wanted. I learned that the estate included the house I'd grown up in, the house where Rebecca had closed the door on me 15 years ago. Without my signature, she couldn't sell it or refinance it, and the property taxes alone were bleeding her dry on her fixed income. My brother Ethan had apparently moved across the country years ago and rarely spoke to her, a detail that gave me a strange sense of vindication, knowing I wasn't the only one who'd eventually walked away from her. The woman who'd always been so certain, so decisive, so unmovable, was now trapped by her own past decisions, waiting for mercy from the daughter she'd thrown away like yesterday's trash. I didn't sleep well that night, my mind replaying every possible scenario like a mental chess game where I controlled all the pieces. Part of me, the part that still remembered being 16 and terrified, wanted to make her feel a fraction of the powerlessness I'd experienced. I could drag this out, set impossible conditions, make her beg in the way I'd once silently begged her to reconsider throwing me out. I imagined her sitting in that house, surrounded by memories and mortgage payments, finally understanding what it felt like when the person holding your future shows you their back. But another part of me, the part that had been forged in those years of loneliness and self-reliance, knew that revenge was a hunger that never truly gets satisfied. I'd watched enough people in business destroy themselves chasing vindication, burning bridges they might need later, sacrificing their peace for the temporary satisfaction of watching someone else suffer. I'd built my entire adult life on the principle that my worth wasn't determined by other people's recognition. So why would I suddenly need Rebecca's suffering to validate my success? The 16-year-old in me wanted justice, but the 31-year-old CEO knew that sometimes the most powerful move is the one that preserves your integrity. What I really wanted, I realized during one of those sleepless nights, wasn't an apology or acknowledgement. Those things had lost their value years ago when I stopped waiting for them. What I wanted was closure, the kind that comes from finally being seen not as the rejected daughter, but as the person who'd survived and thrived without them. I wanted to sign those papers from a position of strength, to demonstrate that I could be gracious without being weak, that I could help without needing anything in return. Because the ultimate freedom isn't making someone pay for hurting you, it's reaching a place where their debt no longer matters. I agreed to meet Rebecca in person at the lawyer's office, a neutral space where our history couldn't contaminate the transaction with ghosts and memories. She arrived 15 minutes early, which my assistant informed me with a knowing look. The power dynamic was so obvious that even strangers could see it. When I finally walked into that conference room, Rebecca stood up from her chair with a posture that tried for dignity but couldn't quite hide the desperation underneath. She'd aged in ways that surprised me. Lines around her eyes and mouth that spoke of stress and regret. Her clothes slightly worn in a way the Rebecca I remembered would never have tolerated. I kept my tone professional, almost cold, as I reviewed the documents my lawyer had already vetted. I didn't ask about her life, didn't inquire about Ethan, didn't offer any opening for the emotional conversation she clearly wanted to have, but couldn't quite initiate. She tried a few times to bridge into personal territory. "You've done so well for yourself," she said, her voice carrying something that might have been pride if it hadn't come 15 years too late. I acknowledged the comment with a polite nod and redirected to the legal paperwork, making it clear that this meeting had one purpose, and sentiment wasn't part of the agenda. Then I did something that surprised even myself. I signed everything without conditions, without demands, without making her grovel or apologize. My lawyer had prepared a list of potential terms I could impose: financial compensation, public acknowledgement, formal apologies. But I pushed the list aside and just signed my name on every line that required it. Not because she deserved my mercy, but because I deserved my peace. I looked her in the eye as I slid the documents across the table and said, "This clears any legal connection between us. After today, we're strangers who happened to share an address a long time ago." Her face crumpled slightly, and I realized she'd been hoping for something more, some door left open for future contact. As I walked out of that lawyer's office for the last time, leaving Rebecca to collect her signed documents and her complicated feelings, I felt something unexpected: lightness. Not the triumphant satisfaction of revenge, but the quiet relief of finally closing a book I'd been carrying around for 15 years. I'd spent so much of my 20s unconsciously performing for an audience of one, trying to prove that throwing me away had been her loss, and in that conference room I realized the performance was finally over. I didn't need her to witness my success for it to be real, didn't need her regret to validate my worth. The drive back to my office took me past the old neighborhood, and on impulse, I took a detour down streets I hadn't seen in over a decade. The house looked smaller than I remembered, the yard less impressive, the whole scene somehow diminished by time and perspective. I didn't feel the surge of pain I'd expected. Instead, I felt grateful to that 16-year-old girl who'd walked down that driveway with everything she owned in a backpack, because she'd made choices in the years that followed that led directly to the life I had now. If Rebecca hadn't closed that door, I might never have discovered what I was capable of building on my own. Not every story about family estrangement ends with tearful reunions and healed relationships, and that's okay. Some endings are about acceptance rather than reconciliation. I learned that you can acknowledge someone's role in your origin story without giving them a role in your current chapters. That blood doesn't obligate you to maintain relationships that cost you your peace. The signature I gave Rebecca that day wasn't an olive branch or forgiveness. It was simply the final punctuation mark on a sentence that had been running on too long. And as I merged back onto the highway toward my office, toward the life I'd built brick by brick without anyone's help, I realized that moving forward had always been a form of self-love, and some doors are meant to stay closed. Then if this story resonated with you, if you've ever had to build yourself from nothing while the people who were supposed to support you watched from the sidelines, then I want you to know you're not alone. The journey from rejection to self-sufficiency isn't easy, and there were countless moments when I wanted to give up, when the loneliness felt unbearable, when I questioned whether I'd ever feel whole again. But here's what I learned. Sometimes the people who abandon you are actually doing you a favor, clearing space for you to become someone far stronger than you ever would have been under their roof. Subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about overcoming impossible odds. about finding strength in the darkest moments, and about building lives that nobody thought we were capable of creating. Hit that notification bell because next week I'm sharing the story of what happened when I ran into my brother Ethan years after Rebecca and I had our final meeting. And what he told me about those years after I left will absolutely shock you. Drop a like on this video if you believe that the best revenge is living well, and that sometimes walking away is the bravest thing you can do. And here's my question for you, the one I want you to really think about before you answer in the comments. Have you ever had to choose between holding on to anger and choosing peace, even when the person who hurt you never truly apologized? What did you choose, and do you regret it? Share your story below because I read every single comment, and your experiences might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. Remember, you're not defined by who rejected you. You're defined by what you built after they walked away. I'll see you in the next video.